beautiful people. Welcome or welcome back to Well With Mika, where we talk real wellness for your real life. I'm Mika, your cultural wellness ally, and today is Thursday Thoughts, baby. All right, Thursday Thoughts is where we get into a conversation that I've had, something that's on my mind that I think many of us can relate to. Today's topic is, are we actually healthier today than we were in the past? Now, specifically, we're going to be dealing with like the 50s through the 70s era, okay? But before we dive in, I need you to understand something. Health isn't just about whether you get sick or how long you live. We're talking about physical health, mental health, social connections, environmental factors, and the systems that shape our daily choices. So if you've read the ebook, okay, you already know this, but I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through this, because when you look at it through all the dimensions, that's when the conversation gets complex and nuanced. And, that's exactly why it's not just a simple then versus now comparison, because that's going to miss the mark, because I want you to think about things like, when you say, or you've heard people say, oh, my grandmother, she lived to be, 90 something years old. She was eating lard, white rice, and whatever grew in her backyard. While you have other health conscious friends that say, oh, they meal prepped and they did CrossFit and then they just diagnosed with, let's say, heart disease or diabetes, and they're only in their, 40s or late 30s. So when people romanticize the good old days, I just want you to pause. Let's all pause and think, do they really want to go back? Like, do we really want to go back to those days? Because those so-called good old days, they also came with polio outbreaks. People were smoking in doctors' offices. I mean, Spam and Jello salads were like, that was staple, So we got to be honest. I don't know how nostalgic you are for those parts. So you got to look at the good and the bad when we're doing this reminisce down memory lane and comparing the time frames. Just keep those things in mind. And then the part of it is that, the answer is not a simple yes or no. It also depends on where in the world you're asking the question and whose health we're talking about, As your cultural wellness ally, I'm going to give you, all of it. We want to zoom out and I want you to explore. We're going to do it together through the lens that honors our diverse experiences, okay? It's not a monolith, look at it as a mosaic, okay? So the first category we're going to deal with is life expectancy and survival. So we're going to start with the numbers, because those numbers, they tell a real important story. In the US and even in Europe, in the 50s, the average life expectancy was about 68. Now by the 70s, it crept up to around 71. But when you check infant mortality, it was high compared to today. And, losing babies was unfortunately common and not rare, okay? And where it gets interesting for our communities, in the Caribbean, for example, in Jamaica, they saw infant mortality fall dramatically in the 60s and 70s, dropping from over 100 deaths per 1,000 births in the 30s to just about 36 in 1970. That is massive progress, right? And then in places like Barbados, their average lifespan went from 53 years in 1950 to over 76 today. That's 2 extra decades of life in one generation. Your great-grandmother might have buried multiple children, but your grandmother likely saw all of her babies grow up. And when I think about my own family, the elders in my family, many of them, they move because they need health care. They want better health care, they want longer lifespan. So we just have to think about that in terms of when we're comparing the time frames and the timelines where we were in the world, right? Now in Africa, in countries like Ghana and Nigeria, life expectancy in the mid 20th century, it was still much lower. Ghana had a drought in 1983 that caused widespread malnutrition and stunted the growth that of of a generation. It affected a whole generation. So for many African countries, health outcomes today are actually far better than they were decades ago. And if we go over to Asia, life expectancy jumped in India from about 50 years in the 70s to nearly 70 today. Thailand and the Philippines cut child mortality in half between 1980 and 2010. And I mean, who doesn't want to celebrate progress like that? So, what's the big picture? We are definitely living longer now, and babies survive more often than they did back then, and you cannot deny that progress. Now, when we move over to infectious disease, this is the part that might surprise you if you're team good old days, okay? Because sometimes we forget, well, especially if you didn't live it, you forget. People say they want to go back, right? But we're not trying to have measles parties. I'm not trying to be in anybody's measles outbreaks. Life before antibiotics, excuse me, I don't think you want that either. Yes, we do abuse it now, but do you want to go back to when it didn't exist? I don't think so. When a simple cut could turn into death? No, no, thank you. I'll take my vaccines and a side of Wi-Fi. Nope, I don't want it. So remember, many of our grandparents, they came from places where malaria, TB were just facts of life. And in the Caribbean, those mid-century years, that was a turning point. There was expanded vaccination campaigns that nearly eliminated tetanus, diphtheria, and whooping cough. And in Asia, mass immunization drastically cut childhood death. So today, these diseases are rare. Unfortunately, some are coming back. We won't get into the politics of it, but it's clear that there's a win for team modern medicine when it comes to dealing with infectious diseases. Now, when it comes to chronic disease, this is kind of where the plot thickens. Because back then in the U.S., smoking was everywhere, okay? Almost half of adults smoke daily, okay? And I'm not talking about weed. We're talking about cigarette smoking. Imagine you sitting in your parent-teacher conferences and the teacher's just like puffing right in the classroom. And that was normal, Obesity and diabetes, though, now that's where the rarity was. There was not widespread obesity and diabetes. Now we're dealing with much less smoking, less than 15%, but we have obesity and type 2 diabetes that have skyrocketed worldwide. So in places like India and the Philippines, where they move from traditional diets to more processed foods, that's fueled the rise of diabetes rates. And even in Jamaica and Barbados, you now see more lifestyle-driven diseases like hypertension and obesity becoming more common. So the reality is really that we traded one epidemic, like smoking, for another, obesity and diabetes. And I mean, some people will say, that's because more people are being fed, which is a good thing, but then now we have to look at quality of life, So we'll get into that a little bit later on. So which brings us to nutrition and diet. So yes, food was less processed back then, but let's not romanticize it too much. Spam and margarine were having a moment, right? And don't get me started on the Jell-O salads, and veggies, what? Okay, right? So that had a moment. That time had a moment. And what we lost that actually mattered could be where where it gets kind of complex, because back then, we had our uncles, our grandparents, they were actually catching the animals, rearing the animals in their backyard. It wasn't factory farms. We had more farming, and that's where you got your food. It wasn't pumped with hormones. And when they cooked rice and beans, they used brown rice and fresh coconut milk, not instant rice and canned coconut cream. In Sri Lanka and India, traditional rice varieties that were rich in iron and fiber were swapped out for like polished rice, white rice during the Green Revolution. And that shift that made food more plentiful, yes, but less nutritious. And so today, that's where you get the higher risk of like diabetes because of those shifts. And something that most people don't consider is the soil. The soil our food grows in today is depleted compared to our grandparents' time. That's just what it is. That tomato from your grandmother's garden had way more nutrients than the organic tomato you buy today in your supermarket, simply because the soil had decades more minerals and microorganisms. Industrial farming has stripped our soil of the very nutrients we're trying to get from our food. So, what's the practical takeaway? Reclaim traditional foods where you can, all right? Local yams, dasheen, cassava, plantain, traditional rice varieties. Those often offer more nutrition than the modern refined options taking up space in the grocery cart. So just think about those things when you're shopping. Think about those things if you're deciding, should I go to the supermarket or go to the farmer's market? What can I grow myself, in whatever space that I have? Just things to consider. Physical activity now. Let's keep this in mind. It's not just about personal choice. Our built environment has fundamentally changed. In the 50s and 60s, people didn't really need gym memberships because daily life was the gym. You were walking everywhere. People were farming. There was manual labor. Kids were playing in the street until they came in at night when the parents call them in. And they filthy, dirty, and then they're ready for dinner. We've literally built the activity out of our daily lives now, and instead we need to schedule it and drive to it or take public transportation, whatever it is, but it's not just as free and as active as it used to be. It's not all good or all bad, but definitely a change that needs to be examined when we're dealing with this topic. So now here's where I have to keep it all real with you. In places like Ghana or Sierra Leone, kids were outside from sunrise to sunset, running, climbing trees without anyone needing to say, get your steps in. But today, what do? We sit at desks, we scroll on screens, and now we got to literally bribe our kids with Wi-Fi passwords just to get them to go outside and touch grass. Look, I'm not judging anybody. I'm not. I'm just telling you what it is. We've turned movement into a chore instead of a way of life. Now, is it all, it's hard sometimes to fight the changes that's going on in the greater society, and manage it within your own households. I get that. I'm giving you the stats. I'm giving you what's happened, the changes that have happened. So no judgment, just information at this point. So when we talk about mental health and stress now, mental health is one of those categories where we've gained so much awareness, but maybe lost the balance. You know what I mean? Back then, depression and anxiety, they weren't even really discussed in most of our communities. You were told, go pray about it, walk it off. Today, thankfully, we have language and treatment options, which is definitely a step forward. But what have we lost? We've lost community ties. Places like Jamaica, Barbados, Ghana, the Philippines, there were stronger ties in earlier decades. Here we knew our neighbors. That whole idea of going and borrowing sugar from your neighbor, that's not widespread anymore. Your neighbors knew your business, for better or for worse. Extended family lived within walking distance, and Sunday family dinners, they weren't really optional. They were sacred. It wasn't so much, there wasn't as much, movement moving further away from your circle. And that sense of belonging and built-in support system is something many of us are desperately trying to recreate today, through the Facebook groups and the wellness communities. I think that's where a lot of these things come into play and why they're necessary, because we've lost those connections. And, the mental health portion of this is so important, and it's not to say that it's not necessary, but we have also gotten a little bit carried away with certain things, because part of the reason why we lose some of these traditions is because we get so caught up in all the language. Oh, I have to set these barriers and these boundaries and don't cross my boundaries, because we've learned new terminology to describe certain things, and that's all well and good, but there is a line that can get crossed where it gets to be a bit much. And then we wonder why we're isolated and why we're lonely. Just things to consider. The next part is relationship with comfort. Okay, what's our relationship with comfort? Something that shifted is how we look at and deal with comfort and convenience. Our ancestors, they expected some discomfort, okay? Walking in the rain, being hot in the summer, cold in the winter, dealing with seasonal food availability. Today, well, we expect 72-degree comfort year round, okay? Excuse me, I don't have central air and central heating. I can't function. I'm done. Done. Food from around the world at any time. I want Thai today, Mexican tomorrow. Give me some African next time. I mean, we are all over the place and we want it all day, every day, and that's just what our norm is. Instant solutions for every problem. And that constant comfort seeking, it might be what's making us less resilient, both physically and mentally. I'm just saying, I'm the messenger, all right? I'm just telling you what's happening. So don't get mad at me. When we move over to environment and public health, yes, there's less plastic than in the 50s, but let's be honest, the air in industrial cities was basically Marlboro flavored, okay? In places like Nigeria, India, industrial pollution hit hard, okay, during periods of rapid development. I mean, look at what Japan and places like Japan and China especially experience with smog, because China's like, look, progress by any means necessary. We trying to take over. And they're like, air quality what? And that's exactly what we experienced back in the day too. So keep those things in mind. And then when we talk about healthcare and technology, the good old days of healthcare meant if you needed a heart transplant in 65, your only option was prayers and maybe a miracle, okay? Today we have MRI scans, minimally invasive surgeries, and cancer treatment that add years of quality of life. So what's the catch? The cost, especially in the U.S., can bankrupt families. And in places in the Caribbean or Asia, universal or low-cost healthcare, it makes access just more equitable, which is something we could definitely learn from here in the States. So what's the bottom line? Are we healthier now than we were in the 50s and 70s? The real answer? We are definitely living longer, but we're also dealing with new challenges. New challenges that our grandparents never faced. So we've gained decades of life, eradicated deadly infections, and developed miracle medicine, really. But we've also lost some of the lifestyle habits, the traditional diets, the social connection that kept our communities not just surviving, but thriving, And as your cultural wellness ally, I believe that and not just your cultural wellness ally, but someone who really, I've evolved in my thought process when it comes to health and wellness. And I truly believe that the path forward is not about going back to the good old days, quote unquote, or staying stuck in the present. Things are usually more nuanced than that. It's really about combining the best of both worlds and looking for, a new solution, some win-win. It's embracing modern medicine while also reclaiming traditional practices that made our ancestors resilient. It's also understanding that modern medicine doesn't know everything and that we should look to nature to see, what cures it holds and what we can learn from it. So what I want you to think about this week is, what's one traditional practice from your culture that actually supported health? Maybe it's walking everywhere instead of driving 2 blocks. That might not be practical, but you know what I mean. Increase your movement, increase your walking. Maybe you don't have to drive to the store. Maybe you could walk. Maybe it's eating seasonally or having those long Sunday family dinners where everyone had to show up and be present, not with the phone in hand, but actually be present with each other. Maybe it's the way your grandmother prepared food with love and intention and not just convenience, Can you bring one of those practices back into your modern life? Not because the past was perfect, but because some wisdom is worth preserving, So next time someone says we need to get back to the good old days, you can smile, give them a nice little something. and say, well, only if you want to trade Netflix for polio and clean water. I'm just saying. You don't have to be like that, though. Don't be petty, Patty. Okay? The truth is, we have a chance to now create better days. So, days where your health isn't just about living longer, but living better. Okay? So, thank you, as always, for tuning in to Well with Mika. This was a long one, I know, but I hope it got you thinking. Okay? And if it did, if you enjoyed it, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone to have a discussion about it. But please don't forget to continue to follow. Follow if you're not following, for more conversations and connection and wellness and everyday life, okay? And until next time, as always, happy healthing. Peace.